The lights twinkled, casting a warm glow over the eager faces in the audience. Dean Martin, smooth as silk in his tuxedo, held the microphone with an easy grace that made everyone feel like they were old friends. His voice, a rich blend of melody and charm, filled the grand hall, dancing between upbeat tunes and playful jokes. Laughter rippled through the crowd like waves, ebbing and flowing with each clever remark and every familiar song. People tapped their feet, swayed in their seats, and hummed along, lost in the magic of the moment. It was a night of pure entertainment, the kind where worries melted away and joy took center stage. The air buzzed with excitement as Dean launched into another beloved classic. He smiled, a twinkle in his eye, and the audience adored him for it. This was what they'd come for, a chance to forget the outside world and simply enjoy the show. Drinks clinked softly, and the murmur of happy chatter blended with the music, creating a perfect symphony of a good time. But then, a jarring note cut through the harmony. Over by the side entrance, near the back of the room, a disturbance began to unfold. At first, it was just a slight commotion, a flicker of movement that most people didn't even notice. But as Dean continued to sing, the movement grew more insistent, more forceful. 2 large security guards dressed in dark suits were seen pushing and pulling at a smaller figure. It was a fan, clearly trying to resist, their face a mixture of confusion and distress. The guards were not being gentle. Their hands were firm, gripping the fan's arms and shoulders, trying to maneuver them toward the exit. It looked less like an escort and more like a forceful removal. The fans stumbled, nearly tripping over their own feet as the guards tugged harder. A few audience members nearby began to turn their heads, their smiles fading into worried frowns. The happy atmosphere started to crack little by little as the harsh reality of the situation began to seep in. The loud music and Dean's smooth voice suddenly felt out of place against the rough actions of the security team. It was a stark contrast, the joyous performance against the quiet struggle in the shadows. The show was still in full swing, but a dark cloud had begun to gather on the edge of the happy scene, threatening to spoil the entire evening for everyone present. The cheerful sounds of Dean Martin's singing began to feel distant as more eyes turned toward the commotion. The 2 security guards, their faces set and unmoving, continued to pull the fan with surprising strength. The fan, a young woman with the bright red lipstick, looked scared and confused. Her arm was twisted behind her back at an awkward angle, and she winced, trying to pull away from their tight grip. It wasn't just a gentle request to leave, it was a physical struggle, clear for anyone to see. Her hat, a small fancy one with a feather, slipped from her head and fell to the carpet. No one bent down to pick it up. All attention was focused on the unfairness of the scene. The guards were much bigger than the woman, towering over her as they forced her along the aisle. She wasn't yelling or causing a scene, which made the guards' actions seem even more out of place. She just looked shocked and a little bit hurt. A few audience members started to whisper. "What's going on?" one man muttered to his wife. "They're being too rough," a woman nearby said, shaking her head. The gentle murmur of happy chatter had been replaced by a nervous buzz. People shifted in their seats, their fun night turning sour. They'd come to see Dean Martin, not to watch someone being treated so poorly. The bright stage lights now seemed to highlight the dark actions happening in the back. The fan's shoes scraped against the floor as she was dragged along. She tried to speak, her voice small and muffled, but the guards ignored her words. Their faces were like stone, focused only on getting her out. It was clear they believed they were doing their job, but the way they were doing it made everyone around them uncomfortable. It felt wrong. The air grew tense, and the smiles that had been so easy to find just moments before had completely vanished from many faces. Even from the stage, Dean Martin, with his keen eye, could sense the change in the room. The energy had shifted, the laughter had died down. He noticed the strained expressions, the craning necks, and the uneasy silence that was creeping in. He hadn't heard what was said, or why the fan was being removed, but he could certainly see the force being used. The sight of the woman being pulled so roughly, her shoulders hunched in distress, was impossible to ignore. It was a clear sign that something was very wrong, and it was quickly ruining the joyful atmosphere he worked so hard to create. The discomfort in the room was almost as loud as the music itself, and it was growing with every step the guards took. The uneasy feeling in the room was growing, and a quiet wave of discomfort that Dean Martin couldn't ignore. He watched from the stage, his smooth singing voice still flowing, but his eyes were fixed on the struggling fan and the heavy-handed guards. He saw the woman's face full of fear and confusion, and the way her body was being twisted. It was clear as day that something was deeply wrong. Many performers, especially those with big shows, would simply look away. They might think it's not their business, or that stopping would ruin the flow of the show. They might let their managers handle it later, or pretend they didn't see anything at all. The show, after all, must go on, as the old saying goes. It's often easier to just keep singing, keep dancing, and let the professionals in the back deal with any problems. The audience paid to see a perfect show, not a pause or a disturbance. But Dean Martin wasn't just any performer. He wasn't the kind of person who could see someone being treated unfairly and simply turn a blind eye. His heart was bigger than that, and his sense of right and wrong was strong. He felt the shift in the room, the way the happy energy had turned tense and worried. He saw the discomfort on the faces of his audience members, and it bothered him deeply. Mid-song, Dean did something truly unexpected. Without a moment's hesitation, he stopped singing. The music, which had been so lively and bright, suddenly faded into silence. The band, caught off guard, slowly trailed off, their instruments quieting one by one. The grand hall, which had been filled with joyous sounds, was now completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Everyone in the audience froze. Their eyes, which had been flicking between Dean and the struggling fan, now snapped back to the stage. They looked at Dean, then at each other, wondering what had just happened. The abrupt halt of the music was like a sudden stop in a fast-moving car. It was shocking. Dean stood there, microphone in hand, his usual playful smile gone. His face was serious, a look of strong purpose in his eyes. He had made a choice, a very clear choice, to stop everything. He wouldn't let the show go on while someone in his audience was being treated so badly. The entire room was stunned, waiting to see what he would do next. The silence was heavy, filled with unspoken questions and a growing sense of anticipation. The silence in the room was so thick you could almost touch it. All eyes were on Dean Martin, who stood tall and unmoving on the brightly lit stage. His microphone was still in his hand, but his usual relaxed posture was replaced by a stiff, serious stance. The playful smile that often graced his lips was gone, replaced by a stern expression that showed he meant business. He looked out into the stunned audience, then his gaze moved directly to the back, where the security guards were still holding the fan. The guards themselves, caught in the sudden quiet, had paused their struggle. They looked up, surprised, their hands still on the woman. They hadn't expected the star of the show to stop everything. They probably thought they were out of sight, just doing their job quietly, but Dean Martin made sure they were seen. He took a deep breath, and his voice, usually so smooth and melodic, cut through the quiet with a surprising sharpness. "Hey!" he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the large room. It wasn't a shout, but it was firm and undeniable. "You two, stop that right now!" His words echoed in the sudden stillness. The two large security guards immediately looked up, their faces showing their shock. They hadn't been called out like that before, especially not by the famous singer himself in front of everyone. They looked at each other, then back at Dean, unsure what to do. The fan, still caught between them, also looked up at the stage, her eyes wide with surprise. Dean didn't wait for them to decide. He took a step forward, closer to the edge of the stage, his voice now even, stronger. "Let go of that young lady," he commanded. "Right now." The authority in his voice was unmistakable. It wasn't just a suggestion, it was an order. The guards, who had been so confident and forceful just moments before, hesitated. They were used to being the ones in charge, the ones giving orders, but now the biggest star in the room was telling them what to do. They looked confused, caught between their orders and the very public command from Dean. The audience watched, breathless. This was not part of the show. This was real. They had never seen a performer stop a show to step in like this. It was a moment that felt both tense and thrilling. The power in the room had suddenly shifted. Dean Martin, the entertainer, had become Dean Martin, the protector. And his words, simple and direct, had completely changed the scene, leaving everyone in the room utterly amazed. The security guards, still looking stunned, slowly loosened their grip on the fan. The young woman quickly pulled her arms free, rubbing her wrists where their hands had been. She looked up at Dean Martin, her eyes still wide, but now with a flicker of hope instead of just fear. The guards, meanwhile, stood awkwardly, their powerful presence suddenly shrunken under Dean's unwavering gaze. Dean stepped even further forward, his voice calm now, but with an edge that left no room for misunderstanding. "Listen," he said, looking directly at the two guards. His voice carried across the silent room, clear as a bell. "This is my show, and at my show we don't treat people like that." He paused, letting his words sink in. The guards shifted their weight, clearly uncomfortable being the centre of such public attention. They were used to being unseen, to doing their work quietly in the background. Now they were on display and being told off by a legend. "I don't know what happened," Dean continued, his voice growing a little stronger, "and I don't care what you think she did. Nobody gets manhandled in my house, not while I'm on this stage." He gestured around the grand hall, making it clear that every inch of that space during his performance was under his care. He wasn't yelling, but his words were like thunder. They were direct and firm, leaving absolutely no doubt about how he felt. He looked at the audience for a moment, his eyes sweeping over their faces, acknowledging their shared discomfort. Then he turned his attention back to the guards. "This isn't a wrestling match," he stated plainly. "This is a place for people to come and have a good time, to enjoy themselves, and when someone comes to my show, they deserve to be treated with respect, period." The guards remained silent, their faces now showing a mix of surprise and a hint of shame. They knew they had been caught. Dean Martin wasn't just stopping a fight, he was laying down the law. He was telling them, and everyone else, that his stage, his performance, and his audience were sacred. He was making it clear that his show was a place of joy and kindness, not rough handling and fear. The message was loud and clear. This kind of behaviour was not allowed, and it would not be tolerated, especially not by him. The entire room understood. Just moments before, the fan had been a small figure, almost invisible, caught between two much larger men. She was being pulled and pushed, her body tense with fear, her voice unheard. Her night, which had started with the promise of fun and music, had quickly turned into a nightmare of public shame and physical discomfort. She expected to be thrown out, to face whatever trouble the guards thought she had caused, and to never step foot in such a grand place again. Her heart must have been pounding with worry and sadness. Then a miracle happened. Dean Martin, the famous singer, the man whose songs she adored, had stopped his whole show. He had called out the guards, not in a quiet whisper, but loud enough for everyone to hear. He had told them to stop, and they had listened. It was as if a powerful spell had been broken. The fan, whose name was probably just ma'am or miss to the guards, suddenly had a champion. Dean Martin, the star, was speaking up for her. He was saying that she deserved respect, that she shouldn't be treated this way. Imagine her surprise. Her jaw probably dropped, and her eyes, which had been filled with tears and fear, now held a look of pure astonishment. It was like something out of a movie, where the hero swoops in to save the day. She stood there, rubbing her sore wrists, looking from the stern-faced guards to the kind but firm Dean Martin. It was a dizzying change. One moment she was powerless, being dragged away like a piece of luggage. The next, she was being defended by one of the biggest stars in the world. It was a complete flip. The security guards, who had seemed so big and scary, now looked small and embarrassed. The audience too felt the weight of this change. They had been worried for her, uncomfortable with the scene. Now, they were witnessing something truly special. A star using his fame not for himself, but to protect someone who had no power. The fan was no longer just a problem to be removed. She was someone important enough for Dean Martin to stop his entire show for. It was a powerful lesson for everyone in the room about kindness, fairness, and standing up for what is right. The young woman, who had been on the verge of tears, now felt a surge of relief and gratitude, a feeling so strong it was almost unbelievable. Every single person in the grand hall was silent, their eyes glued to Dean Martin. No one spoke, no one coughed, no one even shifted in their seat. It was as if time had stopped. They watched Dean on stage, then the two security guards who now stood awkwardly, their heads bowed slightly, looking like scolded children. The young woman, the fan, was still a little shaken, but she was no longer being pulled or pushed. She stood freely, her gaze fixed on Dean, a look of profound gratitude on her face. This was a moment no one would ever forget. Dean Martin wasn't just a singer, he was a force. He didn't just sing songs, he commanded respect. In that quiet room, he had completely turned the situation upside down. Before, the security guards held all the power, able to remove anyone they chose. Now, Dean Martin held all the power. He had shown everyone that night that his authority as the star of the show extended far beyond the stage lights. He didn't need to yell or make a big scene. His calm, firm words had been enough. He had spoken with a quiet strength that made the big, strong guards shrink. They understood that Dean was the boss here, not just of the music, but of the entire atmosphere and how his guests were treated. He had reminded them that they were there to protect, not to harm or scare. The audience saw it all. They saw the shift in power clear as day. The fear and discomfort that had been spreading through the room melted away, replaced by a sense of awe and admiration for Dean. They saw a man who truly cared about his audience, someone who would stand up for what was right, even if it meant stopping his own show, while looked down at the young woman with a kind expression. "Are you all right, miss?" he asked, his voice softer now. The woman nodded shyly, still too stunned to speak much. "Good," Dean said. Then he turned back to the guards. "I think you two can find something else to do, and make sure this young lady has the best seat in the house. Get her a drink too, on me." With those words, the transformation was complete. The guards, without a word, slowly backed away, their faces still a bit red. They knew they had been publicly corrected. And the fan, moments from being thrown out, was now being offered a prime seat and a drink by Dean Martin himself. It was a complete reversal, all orchestrated by one man's strong sense of fairness. Everyone understood who was truly in charge that night. What happened that night at Dean Martin's show was more than just a moment. It became a story told again and again, spreading like wildfire through Hollywood and beyond. People talked about how Dean, a big star, had stopped his whole show to stand up for a regular person. This wasn't just a kind gesture, it was a powerful lesson for everyone who ran big venues and hired security guards. News of the incident quickly reached the ears of those in charge. Theatre owners, managers, and event organisers heard about Dean Martin's public stand. They understood that if Dean Martin, a star known for his easygoing charm, could get so serious about how a fan was treated, then something truly needed to change. It made them think about their own rules and how their staff acted. Before this, some security teams might have felt they could do whatever they wanted, as long as they kept order. But Dean's actions showed that being in order didn't mean being rough or unkind. It meant being respectful. The way he spoke up, so clearly and publicly, forced everyone to look closely at how they managed their crowds. Suddenly meetings were held in big offices. People started rewriting rulebooks. They began to put in new policies that made it very clear. Security guards should use less force. They should try to talk to people first instead of just grabbing them. There were new talks about being polite and understanding even when someone was causing trouble. The main goal changed from just removing problems to making sure everyone felt safe and respected. This wasn't a small change. It meant that many fans, in many different places, would be treated better because of what Dean Martin did. The one fan he protected that night was certainly helped, but his brave act had a much bigger ripple effect. It helped countless others who might have faced similar rough treatment in the future. It reminded everyone that even in a big, busy place, kindness and respect should always come first. Dean's actions proved that one person, especially a famous one, could truly make a difference for many. The tale of Dean Martin and the overzealous security guards is more than just a memory from a long-ago show. It's a clear example of how someone with a lot of influence can truly make a difference. Dean Martin was a household name, a beloved singer and actor. His face was on magazines, his voice on the radio, and his shows were always sold out. He had power, not just as a boss on stage, but as a famous person people looked up to. That night, he could have easily let the security guards do their job, no matter how rough. He could have finished his song, waved goodbye and gone home, leaving the fan to deal with her troubles alone. No one would have blamed him. Most people might have done just that. But Dean chose a different path. He used his famous name, his bright spotlight, and his respected voice to stand up for someone who had none of those things. The fan was just one person in a large crowd with no special power or fame. She couldn't fight against two big security guards, and her own voice would have been lost in the commotion. She was completely helpless in that moment. But because Dean Martin was Dean Martin, his words carried weight. When he said, "Stop that right now," it wasn't just a suggestion, it was an order that everyone had to listen to. His fame gave him the power to pause an entire show and challenge authority in a very public way. He used his platform, the very stage he performed on, as a shield for someone who needed protection. This story shows us that true fame isn't just about selling records or filling seats. It's about having a voice that people listen to and choosing to use that voice for good. Dean Martin could have used his fame to get special things for himself or to ignore problems that didn't directly affect him. Instead, he used it to make sure a stranger was treated fairly. He used his star power to protect someone who was powerless, proving that his kindness was as big as his talent. It was a beautiful act of caring that resonated deeply with everyone who witnessed it, and for years to come. The remarkable story of Dean Martin's kindness that nugget teaches us a very important lesson. It shows us that being a star is not just about being famous or talented. It's not only about singing great songs or making people laugh. True star power, the kind that truly shines, comes from having a good heart and using your strength to help others. Dean Martin could have easily ignored the problem. He could have just focused on his own show, which was going perfectly well. But he chose to stop everything. He chose to use his big voice and his famous name to stand up for someone who was small and helpless. He showed everyone that night that a person's worth is not about how famous they are, but about how they treat others. This lesson is important for all of us, not just for movie stars or singers. It means that when we see someone in trouble or being treated unfairly, we should try to help. Even if we don't have a famous name, we can still use our own voices, our own kindness, and our own courage to make a difference. It might be speaking up for a friend, helping someone who is sad, or making sure everyone is treated fairly at school or at home. Dean Martin's actions remind us that true greatness comes from caring. It comes from being brave enough to do the right thing, even when it might be easier to look away. He used his special place in the world to make the world a little bit better, one fan at a time. His legacy isn't just about his wonderful songs and funny jokes. It's also about his big heart and his strong sense of justice. So the next time you think about what it means to be a star, remember Dean Martin. Remember how he stopped his show not for applause but for kindness. Remember how he stood up for someone who needed help, showing us all that the brightest stars are those who use their light to shine on others, especially those who can't shine for themselves. It's a lesson that will always be important, showing us how to be truly good people.